All right, go ahead and turn to 1 Kings chapter 18. We are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. And typically, if you know anything about Elijah, it's this chapter that you know. This is probably, when we do kids' classes and studies for younger folks about Elijah, chapter 18 is the one that is the most exciting and the one that is often brought up. So there's going to be a little bit of a time jump here. Remember back at the beginning of chapter 17, Elijah basically declared to King Ahab that there was going to be a drought in Israel. There'd be no rain, not even any dew on the ground, basically until he says so. And the reason he would say so is because God says so. So when we get to 18, over 3 years have passed, 3.5 actually, and we're going to kind of see that here. Actually, let's just go ahead and get into it, and we'll kind of talk about it. I'll probably repeat myself. Someone read just the first verse of chapter 18, please.
After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land.
Okay, so like I said, we had this declaration back at the beginning of chapter 17. There's going to be no rain. And now we get to the beginning of chapter 18 here. It's been 3 years of drought, not even dew, as I said before. And if you remember last week when we looked at Luke chapter 4, Jesus said it was 3.5 years that there was no rain on the land. So we're probably midway through this year at this point. I don't think there's a lot of time that passes during chapter 18 itself. So it's been about 3.5 years that this has been going on. And remember, this is zero precipitation, zero dew. There's been nothing for 3.5 years here. So God basically tells Elijah to go back and present himself to King Ahab. Now, this whole time, where has Elijah been? He's been in hiding. God's plan has been to keep Elijah out of the hands of Ahab, and now he's telling him after 3.5 years, okay, now it's time to go back and confront Ahab. Now's the time. Now, we may wonder, why did God choose this specific time? There's not a lot that's going to clue us into why exactly this time, but enough time has come that we see that this famine has been really bad. In fact, we're going to read a little bit about more in this chapter. We've seen that the brook dried up in chapter 17 that Elijah was drinking from, and then he had to go up to Zarephath and Sidon to a widow there. There seemed to not really have much either, and it's possible the drought was affecting that area as well, because she had just about nothing, and Elijah tells her that there would be rain that the flour and the oil would not run out until rain came back upon the land, which may indicate that was also affecting the area of Sidon as well, where it's kind of mudded. It's not exactly clear the way that it's worded, but it's possible. So it's been going on this entire time, but God says, now is the time, Elijah, now is the time to go back to Ahab to get out of hiding, and we're gonna have a little bit of a talk with Ahab here, more than a talk, I suppose. We'll get into it. Any comments, questions on verse 1 before we kind of get into the meat of this chapter? It's kind of just an introduction there. Okay, someone read for us verses 2 through 6 now, please.
So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab, and there was a severe famine in Samaria. And Ahab had called Obadiah, who was in charge of his house. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. For so it was, while Jezebel massacred the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them, 50 to a cave, and had fed them with bread and water. And Ahab had said to Obadiah, go into the land to all the springs of water and to all the brooks. Perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so that we will not have to kill any livestock. So they divided the land between them to explore it. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself.
Okay. So we kind of get into what's going on Ahab's end here at the time. We have, before we get into that, God said to Elijah in the first verse, go present yourself to Ahab. Exactly the next verse, Elijah goes. So he's following through on this. And I want to keep bringing this up. When God tells Elijah to do something, go to this place, go to that place, this is going to happen. Elijah just goes. There's no arguments, there's no questions, there's no conversation. I bring this up every time because this is different than what we see later. After chapter 18, we're going to see Elijah basically talking to God and say, why is it like this? Why am I having to do these things? Why have you allowed this to happen? There's a very notable back and forth between Elijah and God about why things are going on the way they are, and Elijah not really understanding. If that is going on during these moments earlier here, we're not told about them. My impression is that Elijah is just going and doing it. He's being, the good, faithful, dutiful soldier, and he's doing exactly what he's told. That's kind of the implication we get from this text. But notice these now, because that's not going to be how it is later. Elijah's going to have some real questions later on. But here he goes. And meanwhile, Ahab is working with Obadiah on a mission. Now, it calls him, I think, that one who was in charge of his house in the translation that was read. Some translations say palace administrator, or you might get like chief servant. You're going to get someone who is in charge of the royal household in some major capacity. So he's a high official in Ahab's court, a very important person. And they're going on this mission. But before we talk about what they're doing, what their mission is here, we get a little brief aside about Obadiah to kind of fill us in on who this guy is, which is really helpful because later in the chapter that becomes sort of important to why he does what he does. To be clear, just for clarification, this is not the same Obadiah that wrote the book of Obadiah. There are like 11 different Obadiahs in the scripture, so it's not that guy. In fact, I think this is, this chapter he's brought up, and then all the other Obadiahs you see later in scripture, different guys. So as far as I understand, he's not going to come up again after this chapter, which is why it's beneficial that we're filled in on some of his details here, because we're not going to see him at a later time. But just so you know, Obadiah is a very common name. It's not, it's like John. Everybody's named John now. It's one of the most common names in our culture. So he's just a guy named Obadiah, not the same as the one who wrote the book. And like I said, he's a major official in King Ahab's court. And we have to recognize that this is a time of persecution for God's people. Jezebel, there were already, every single Israelite king of the northern kingdom was already bad, was already doing bad things. But then you had Omri, the father of Ahab, who was worse than all the others. And then you have Ahab, who was described as worse than all the others before him. So somehow it tops Omri also. And then you had his marriage to Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon, who brought in Baal worship. There was probably already idol worship going on, but she made that a very central part of the royal politics and got Ahab to state sponsor a temple to Baal in Samaria. And we're going to see kind of more of that throughout this chapter. That is what the royal household is pushing, is worship to Baal. And it talks about here a little bit about the persecution that Jezebel is, sending out people to kill the prophets of God. And during this time, Obadiah has kind of been part of this resistance, and he's hidden 100 of them in 2 caves, 50 in each. So it describes him as a man who is still faithful to God, and it shows it. He is trying to help God's people, despite the occupation he currently is in. Now, there is nothing wrong with being a worker of the state, if you will. That's probably the way we would describe it now. He's working for the government, but his boss is a really bad guy. But even in that case, he's trying to do the right thing, but he's probably doing it in secret. There is no way that he is holding this position and is being very open about his service to God. I'm almost guaranteed Jezebel would have had him removed by that point. Removed probably in, killing him off, removed. Not a very nice thing. And it also says that the 100 prophets of God he has hidden. He has supplied them also with food and water. Now, I think that is really interesting because we're in a drought, right? We've had 3.5 years of drought, but it says he's been supplying them with food and water. Where is he getting this food and water from? Do do you think? Because we've seen Elijah, he's been kind of struggling here and there, and God's been doing some miraculous stuff to keep him alive. Where is Obadiah getting this food for 100 people during this time? Any thoughts? We'll go Arnold and Jeff. All right, taken from the king's pantry.
I'm just going to say he's the king. He's got the whole land. He's number one.
Yeah, so that's my assumption as well. My guess is he's basically stealing from Ahab and Jezebel's table to get to these guys. Because if you consider this drought, if there's going to be one person who's going to be fed, it's going to be the king. He's going to make sure he's got his first. In fact, we see this in today's time. If you know anything about North Korea, one of the things you know is that food is very scarce in that nation. But there's one guy who always gets his meal, and that's the guy at the top. So that's not a totally outrageous thing to assume. So he's being a chief administrator or servant in Ahab's palace or household. He probably has access to that. He's probably got the means to do it. So he's probably doing all that in secret again, which is putting himself in grave danger. You know, he just has to get caught one time, and then, you know, that's it. I mean, who cares if he's, serving God or serving Baal? He's stealing from the king. We got to take this guy out, and they don't mean just layoffs. So he's really doing some great work here under extreme threat of danger of life. He will probably be killed if any of these things get found out. So Obadiah is doing this work. So getting back to Ahab and Obadiah, what they're doing, Ahab says we need to go through all the land, all the springs, brooks, valleys, wherever we can go to find grass for our horses and our mules. Now, this would kind of imply to us that the royal stable is either out or close to out of feed for their livestock, for these animals. And there's a few reasons why you would want to avoid killing these animals at all costs if you can. I mean, one is these are your pack animals. They're going to help you transport things. That's an extremely important thing if you're trying to get goods to and from the palace, and or if you have warfare, you want some horses to pull your chariots, things of that nature. Those are definitely very useful animals, very utilitarian, very good for military prowess. But these animals are not exactly the best for food either. I mean, these are like always the last ones you kill when things get real bad. They start killing the donkeys and the mules and the horses. That's when you know it's really bad because they're not really the best for meat. They have sort of that reputation. But also, these animals would not be considered clean animals to eat, I believe, under the old law. Now, this may not be an issue for them. They're already kind of serving Baal anyway. But that would be kind of further in that direction as well. So they're trying to avoid this situation of slaughtering all these mules and horses. So they're going out looking for grass, looking for feed for them. So they basically split up the land and say, you go this way, I'm going to go that way, and we'll cover all the territory and we'll see what we can find. So that's what they're doing. So Elijah's coming back to Israel. Obadiah and Ahab, they're going out looking for feed for the mules and horses, and that's where we are at this point. Any comments up through verse 6? Jeff?
I want to go back to Obadiah and the quietness of his service to God. Some people would think that that's a compromise to be quiet about your religion, but we are commanded in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 12 to aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business and to work with your hands. So there's nothing wrong with that. There is a point in time, and we'll know when that time comes, when we need to stand. Our conscience will, if you're trained by the scriptures, your conscience will tell you when that moment is that you have to stand up. Obviously, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are great examples of times when you have to stand. There's nothing wrong with leading a quiet life. Some people have the idea that if you don't trumpet your faith on Facebook, or social media all the time, and you don't let everybody know where you stand on everything, that you're somehow hiding something. And that's not the case. You can lead a quiet life and be ready when that time comes for you to stand. But what Obadiah is doing is
Yeah, and you brought up Daniel earlier. The kind of relationship that Daniel had with Nebuchadnezzar is a pretty interesting comparison to what we have here. Nebuchadnezzar was not a godly, righteous man at the beginning of Daniel. And he does, we have sort of these multiple things where Daniel does something and Nebuchadnezzar says, oh, your God must be the God. And then the next chapter, he seems to have forgotten all about that. And we see that multiple times. And, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have their encounter with him as well. And he says, oh, their God must be the God. And how many times does he have to learn that same lesson? Well, it seems close to the midway point of Daniel, he does learn that lesson. He does come around. He basically writes in first person in the book of Daniel the things he learned, the things he understood, and he does recognize that God is the God. There's no other gods like him. It seems by the end of his life, Nebuchadnezzar seems to come around to that conclusion. I don't think Ahab ever quite gets there. From all things I understand from Ahab, he was still a bad king through and through. He never really comes around. He'll see what God does. He'll recognize, oh, there's great power, but he never gets away from that idolatry. And probably the influence of his wife is not helping at all. She is a big thorn in his side. He was probably already bad without her, but she certainly doesn't help that situation at all. But it is interesting you bring up that comparison because not only do we have an opportunity to interact with people who may not be godly, may not be righteous, may not really care what we have to think at times, but sometimes those times come up or they see something or they notice something and that gives opportunity. And we also need to remember that God is using some of these people in ways that we don't understand. Nebuchadnezzar was an instrument of God in wiping out the sin that was going on in Judah. Now, that was a really terrible and hard time for them, but when they came back, they were in a better position than they were beforehand. They were all in sin. They were all in idolatry. After that, they still had problems, but it was not those problems. And same with Ahab here. I think Ahab is being used by God in several ways, and we're going to go through several stories about Ahab before we're done with the study. But Ahab doesn't quite come around the same way that Nebuchadnezzar does. But it's an interesting comparison when you look at it that way. Did you have a follow-up?
One other thing. That is a good comparison. Nebuchadnezzar would listen to Daniel. Ahab wouldn't listen to God's prophets. He hated God's prophets. So that's a big difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Ahab. So what that teaches us is that if in your relationship with other people or your boss or whomever, if you sense that they might be of a frame of mind to listen to you when you talk about things about God, then now it's time to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, your conscience will guide you if it's trained by God's word to know when the time is right to speak up. But it's okay to lead a quiet life.
Yeah, if Obadiah speaks up now, he's dead. And so, yeah.
If there's a time for that, there's a time for that. But what we're thinking about is what's best for the cause of Christ. It's best for Obadiah to live and not just go out with a blaze of glory, for no real accomplishment. So if he waits for a better time, Ahab had chances. That's what you say about Ahab.
And specifically for Obadiah, he has 100 people depending on him.
Yeah.
So he's got to think about that as, he could do that. He could be the martyr, but then what happens to all these other guys? What does that really accomplish? It's, let Elijah do that stuff, I guess. That's what we're going to see in a little bit. Any other comments up through verse 6? Okay, let's continue on. Someone read for us verses 7 through 15, please. 7 through 15.
Now, as Obadiah was on his way, suddenly Elijah met him, and he recognized him and fell on his face and said, "Is that you, my lord Elijah?" And he answered, "It is I. Go tell your master, Elijah is here." Then he said, "How have I sinned that you are delivering your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to hunt for you. And when they said, 'He is not here,' he took an oath from the kingdom or nation that they could not find you. And now you say, 'Go tell your master, Elijah is here.' And it shall come to pass, as soon as I am gone from you, that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you to the place I do not know. So when I go and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, he will kill me. But I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Was it not reported to you
Okay. We're going to pause there. So we don't know where Obadiah is when this conversation with Elijah occurs. He's out somewhere doing his job, doing what Ahab asked him to do. So we don't know exactly where this encounter is. I imagine it's somewhere in the land of Israel. We're not in Sidon anymore. But I don't have anything else to really go on here. But he's searching. Elijah meets him, and Obadiah recognizes him. So these guys know each other. It's been a few years, but they do know each other. He recognizes him, and he's surprised to see him. He's shocked, in fact, and he's going to say in a little later why. But Elijah kind of gets right to business. He tells Obadiah, "Go tell Ahab that I've come back." And Obadiah sees this as a death sentence, and he has some interesting logic about that. He kind of talks to Elijah about what's been going on. In verse 10, Elijah details that Ahab, he's sent men into every nation, every kingdom to look for Elijah. I think the translation that Buddy used was the word hunt for Elijah. He is a wanted man, he's a fugitive, and it's not just the borders of Israel that he's looking for him. He is sent to every nation, every kingdom. So any place that Ahab could think that Elijah could go, he has sent somebody to go look for Elijah. So we had earlier in chapter 17, he was up in the region of Sidon and Zarephath. Someone was probably out there looking for him. It may have been close calls. We don't know how close they got to him there. It's not really clear, but he wasn't caught. But it was not for lack of trying. Ahab was seeking to kill him. He was seeking his life, no matter where he was. And so now Obadiah kind of fears that, if he leaves to go get Ahab, saying, "Hey, Elijah's here now," and, he comes back, they're going to return, and Ahab's not going to find Elijah because Elijah's been very elusive this whole time. Who knows where he's at? He's somewhere, but we can't find him. And then Obadiah says, "Well, I found him." And then, Ahab shows up and says, "Well, he ain't here." And then you're dead because you've been wasting my time and lying to me. Obadiah definitely fears the wrath of Ahab here. And, Obadiah declares, I've been serving the Lord. What sin have I committed? I've been helping these prophets. I've been doing the right thing. Why would you do this to me? And it seems this final verse we read here, verse 15, it seems that Elijah's trying to comfort Obadiah here. He says, "As surely as the Lord lives." So he's giving him this promise. And Obadiah, being a God-fearing and faithful man, will accept this at the word, saying, "As surely as the Lord lives." Elijah says, "I'm going to present myself to Ahab." So this is a reassurance to Obadiah that this is not going to be your last day on earth here. It's going to be all right. He's not going to kill you. I'm actually going to confront Ahab. I'm not going to run away. So he's trying to comfort Obadiah, I think, a little bit here, so that Obadiah is not afraid to report to Ahab that Elijah has come. And that's as far as we got in the reading. Any comments up to this point, through verse 15? Okay, so we're kind of in the setup here for the showdown of Mount Carmel, and we're kind of going to get into it maybe a little bit. We don't have a lot of time left. But let's get in the next section here of verses. Someone read verses 16 through 20, please.
So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. Then it happened, as Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table."
And 20. Yeah.
So Ahab sent for all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel.
Okay, so apparently, Obadiah goes and he gets King Ahab. He tells him that Elijah's returned, and Ahab comes over and he confronts Elijah. So finally now Elijah and Ahab are seemingly face to face here. And Ahab has the nicest words to say to Elijah when he sees him, of course. He says, "Is that you?" you troubler of Israel, you no good troublemaker. Is that you? And it's it's not nice. Obviously, it's sarcasm there. He apparently seems to blame Elijah for all the problems that are going on, notably this drought, and then all the problems that are coming with this drought. And it was Elijah that showed up in the beginning of verse 17 and said, "Okay, well, until I say otherwise, there's not going to be any rain here." So, I could see where he comes to that conclusion that this is all Elijah's fault, and this is why he wants Elijah dead, because Elijah is somehow the problem here. But I love Elijah's response to this, because he turns this completely around and says, "It's not me, it's you guys." It's you, it's your household. You've brought trouble because they have abandoned the commandments of the Lord. If they were serving God the way they were supposed to, Elijah would have never been sent in the first place to declare this drought. God would have not sent a drought. They would probably be flourishing. They would be doing fine. But because they had abandoned the ways of the Lord, this is how this has come to be. If you remember, when we first started this study, going back to chapter 16, it talks very specifically about all the bad things that were leading up to this point. And we talked about the bad kings before that led up to Ahab, how Omri was the worse than all the ones before him, and then Ahab, his son, was worse than even him, and all the things that Ahab had done, building a temple to Baal, accepting the Baal worship. They clearly abandoned God, like full stop, no question. There's persecution of the Lord's prophets. We've talked about that with Obadiah. It's, how can Ahab say, "Oh, this is Elijah's fault," and not look in the mirror and say, maybe I'm not doing something right? Apparently that's never crossed his mind. It is Elijah's fault. But Elijah has turned it right back on him and said, "You were the one that abandoned the Lord. You've turned aside to Baal worship. In essence, you're the troubler of Israel. You're the one who's caused this." So I love that beginning exchange, and that's apparently when they first run into each other. This is how they greet each other. They don't like each other. You might get that out of that conversation. So Elijah essentially tells King Ahab that we're going to have a showdown here. This is what we're setting up for, is this showdown in Mount Carmel between God and Baal. And Elijah has instructions for Ahab, which Ahab is going to go through with, which, why would he agree to this? Why doesn't he just kill Elijah right there? It's not clear. Maybe he does recognize what Elijah says is true. Maybe it is Ahab who's the problem and the things he's doing. But he's going to accept this challenge. He tells him to gather all the people of Israel to Mount Carmel. And when he says all people of Israel, I don't think he means every single person in the entire population is going to be there. But you're going to have representatives from every town probably in Israel. It might be the elder or some sort of person that is sent from there, or at least from the tribes. I imagine there's a lot of people. That's the implication we're going to get. But it's not going to be every single person in the entire nation. But it's going to be definitely representatives from every place in the nation. And then he also tells him to bring with him the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And we get some details here that I think are really interesting, and we'll probably have to talk more about this next week because we're running short on time. But we're told that there are 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, so that's 950 total false prophets we've got here. And it says here that these prophets they dine at the table of the Queen Jezebel here. Now that implies to me, and I think this is not a far stretch, is not that, she invites them for a meal every day and says like, "Hey, hang out, we'll have a little party and it'll be." I think they are retained and probably paid for and taken care of by the palace and the state, if you will. So like the tax dollars that they're gathering from Israel is probably paying these people. Again, you have sort of state-sponsored idol worship going on. This would probably align perfectly with the fact that Ahab built a temple to Baal in Samaria. That all fits, that all connects, that all makes sense. So it's interesting, kind of this. It's a little bit of an aside comparison, but Obadiah is, probably swiping food and water to send to these 100 prophets of God who are hiding in 2 caves. And meanwhile, you've got nearly 1,000 false prophets that are just dining at Jezebel's table. They're probably getting the best. They're taken care of. They don't have to worry about anything. As long as they take care of the Baal and Asherah worship, that's all they're there for. So not really being productive to anything. I mean, take out the whole idol worship thing. They're not doing anything that benefits the economy of the population. And then you have the fact that they're false prophets on top of that. This is a huge waste of resources, and it's definitely putting them against God. So not a great situation to be in. But he asked for them to also be summoned to Mount Carmel. That is, Elijah asked Ahab to bring them to Mount Carmel. So we're going to get this situation where it's Elijah versus a whole bunch of other people here. He's going to be, in essence, outnumbered once they're all gathered. So, like I said, King Ahab does what Elijah requests. The people of Israel gather at Mount Carmel, as do the prophets, the false prophets that he asks to be there. And just for kind of context, because this is going to be important perhaps a little bit later in this chapter, the location of Mount Carmel, it's in Israel. It's in the northern kingdom of Israel, sort of on the northern half, I guess. But it's close to the Mediterranean Sea. It actually looks out over the sea. This is going to become an important detail later on in this chapter. So I'm just bringing that up now. This location is, you can get on top of the mountain, you can see the sea, basically. It's not that far from the Mediterranean. So, all right, any comments up through verse 20 then? Go ahead, Jeff.
As a testament that God doesn't take our sin personally. There's a sense in which he doesn't. He doesn't attack Ahab personally. He attacks the gods Ahab is turning to. All of the plagues of Egypt were attacking the Egyptian gods. God didn't attack Pharaoh personally. And here he's attacking the gods that Ahab has turned to demonstrate that they are nothing. And we need to remember that when we sin, yes, it is bad, and we certainly should sorrow, should experience guilt and remorse and regret for that. But God, it never reaches a point, if we're willing to turn back to him, that God isn't willing to receive us. It is not personal in that sense. It is personal in which it does disappoint him and maybe hurt him in some sense, because he gave his son for us. But it's never so much that he cuts us off. If we're willing to come back, he will hear us and forgive us. So, and I think it's just a small, tiny example of that. God doesn't attack Ahab personally, or even Jezebel. He attacks, because they could be saved if they were willing, but he attacks the gods that they profess.
Yeah, I guess probably one of the maybe more modern ways people look at this is, God's out to get me kind of thing. Well, no, God's not out to get us. He's out to save us. But as loving as he is, he's also just. So if we decide we don't want to have anything to do with God, we want to do our own thing, okay, but there is going to be a consequence for that. That's not because, God thinks like, oh, you're ugly and I don't like you. And no, he loves every person. He wants every person to come and receive salvation, but he's not going to let sin just kind of, oh, you're a sinful person. No, that's no problem. That's not good. He is righteous. He is just. He is going to, in essence, give some consequences for our sin. Now, thankfully for all of us, Jesus died on the cross, became a sacrifice to absolve us of those sins, but only if we follow him. There is a requirement there. We have to, lose our self. We have to be selfless, follow after Christ, follow after his example, proclaim him. There's all sorts of things that we can look into that, but there is a bit of a requirement there. But that's not because God doesn't like us. We wouldn't even have that opportunity if he didn't love us. So we need to, sometimes we have to reframe that mindset. People's like, well, God is, he's a terrible God because he's doing all these terrible things to people. That is totally ignoring all the things that he has done for us. I think that's part of the problem that a lot of society looks at is, well, why would you serve this God who's not loving and not helpful and good to everyone? He is. It's just not from the way they're looking at it. So that's definitely an interesting conversation we can probably have with people. That's probably the way I look at it. And we've kind of talked about this earlier that, this is an attack on Baal more than anything. This is why drought was the punishment that has been chosen for these last 3.5 years, is because Baal was supposed to be the god of weather and storms, and God has stopped that from being a thing. They haven't had any of that. And I'm sure that they've been crying out to Baal probably every day since this drought started, begging for rain. And well, that rain hasn't come. But now here's Elijah, and he's going to give them one last opportunity to turn that around at the showdown of Mount Carmel. So very good. Any other comments, Jeff?
Just in connection with that, when we get in discussions with people, we can't take it personally either.
Oh yeah, we can't because
We attack false doctrine, but we don't attack the people that we're talking to.
Jesus himself said, "Blessed are you when people say all kinds of evil things about you because of me." It's not that they don't like you; they don't like the fact that you're following after Jesus. And Jesus said, "Just understand that. That's going to happen. Expect it." Very good. I'm going to do one last section. Someone read for us verses 21 through 24, please.
And Elijah came unto all the people and said, How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not a word. Then said Elijah unto the people, even I only, remain a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men.
Through 24, please.
Let them therefore give us 2 bullocks, and let them choose 1 bullock for themselves, and cut it into pieces, lay it on the wood, and put no fire under it. And I will dress the other bullock, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire under it. And call ye on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God that answered by fire, let him be God. And all the people answered and said, It is well spoken.
Okay, so we're going to finish this off quickly. I know I'm just about out of time, but I wanted to get this last part in. So everyone's gathered. They're all at Mount Carmel. And Elijah is here, and he's got this proposition. I got an idea. Listen to this idea. And the first thing he does is, they should follow the true God. If the Lord is the God, follow him. If Baal is the God, follow him. Let's end this controversy. Let's just get it done. In essence, and I think the people's reaction is interesting here. It says that they're silent or that they said nothing. I'm not sure what the internal thoughts of the people were. We could kind of guess, like maybe they're just, continuing to listen. Okay, like how are we going to determine this? Or maybe, they've kind of been hit and they didn't expect, like, well, yeah, I've been kind of like doing both things, and that probably doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure where they are in their mindset, but they don't argue at that point. Elijah, he compares himself. He's, I'm the only prophet of God here. There's these 450 prophets of Baal over here, and here's the kind of the terms of the contest. We're going to make 2 sacrifices. We're going to have 2 bulls. We're going to prepare them, dress them up, get them ready for the sacrifice. But neither team here is going to set fire to it. So the 450 prophets of Baal, you got your bull, you got your sacrifice, get it all ready to go, but don't set fire to it. And I'm going to take my bull and I'm going to get it all ready, but I'm not going to set fire to it either. And then we're both going to call on the name of our God, and whichever one responds with fire, that's the God. We're going to end this controversy. That's going to be it. And I think, the people who are there, they seem to think that this is good. They're like, all right, sounds like a deal. Let's do it. So we're going to have this big contest next week. We're out of time. So that's the setup. We're ready to go. And we're going to see how it unfolds next week. Probably a lot of you know how this turns out. But it's a great story, and I'm going to have probably plenty to say about it. So we'll pick up verse 25 next week. We'll probably just end up finishing the chapter. I don't know if we'll start chapter 19 or not, but chapter 19 will be next. So you might want to read ahead just a little bit just in case. So we'll pick up there next week at verse 25. Thank you.